Okay, let's talk about the Middle Passage. For slaves, the voyage across the Atlantic, known as the Middle Passage because it was the second or middle leg in the triangular trading routes linking Europe, Africa, and America, was a harrowing experience. Since a slave could be sold in America for 20 to 30 times the price in Africa, men, women, and children were crammed aboard vessels as tightly as possible to maximize profits. The height sometimes between decks, wrote one slave trader, was only 18 inches, so that the unfortunate human beings could not turn around or even on their sides, and here they are usually chained to the decks by their necks and legs. The journey on the Middle Passage was filled with shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying. Diseases like measles and smallpox spread rapidly, and about one slave in 5 perished before reaching the New World. Ship captains were known to throw the sick overboard in order to prevent the spread of epidemics. The crews on slave ships also suffered a high death rate. Only a small proportion, less than 5%, of slaves carried to the New World were destined for mainland North America. The vast majority landed in Brazil or the West Indies, where the high death rate on the sugar plantations led to a constant demand for new slave imports. As late as 1700, only about 20,000 Africans had been landed in Britain's colonies in North America. In the 18th century, however, their numbers increased steadily. Overall, the area that was to become the United States imported between 400,000 and 600,000 slaves. By 1770, due to the natural reproduction of the slave population, around 1/5 of the estimated 2.3 million persons, not including Native Americans, living in the English colonies of North America were Africans and their descendants. By the mid-18th century, 3 distinct slave systems were well entrenched in Britain's mainland colonies: tobacco-based plantation slavery in the Chesapeake, rice-based plantation slavery in South Carolina and Georgia, and non-plantation slavery in New England and the Middle Colonies. The largest and oldest of these was the tobacco plantation system of the Chesapeake, where more than 270,000 slaves resided in 1770, nearly half of the region's population. On the eve of the Revolution, Virginia and Maryland were as closely tied to Britain as any other colonies, and their economies were models of mercantilist policy. They supplied the mother country with a valuable agricultural product, imported large amounts of British goods, and were closely linked in culture and political values to London. As we have seen, the period after 1680 witnessed a rapid shift from indentured servitude to slavery on the region's tobacco plantations. In the 18th century, the growing world demand for tobacco encouraged continued slave imports. As Virginia expanded westward, so did slavery. By the eve of the American Revolution, the center of gravity of slavery in the colony had shifted from the Tidewater, the region along the coast, to the Piedmont further inland. Most Chesapeake slaves, male and female, worked in the fields, but thousands labored as teamsters, as boatmen, and in skilled crafts. Numerous slave women became cooks, seamstresses, dairymaids, and personal servants. Slavery laid the foundation for the consolidation of the Chesapeake elite, a landed gentry that, in conjunction with merchants who handled the tobacco trade and lawyers who defended the interests of slaveholders, dominated the region's society and politics. Meanwhile, even as the Consumer Revolution improved the standard of living of lesser whites, their long-term economic prospects diminished. As slavery expanded, planters engrossed the best lands and wealth among the white population became more and more concentrated. Slavery transformed the Chesapeake society into an elaborate hierarchy of degrees of freedom. At the top stood large planters, below them numerous lesser planters and land-owning yeomen, and at the bottom a large population of convicts, indentured servants, tenant farmers, who made up half of white households in 1770, and of course the slaves. With the consolidation of a slavery society in the Chesapeake, planters filled the law books with measures enhancing the master's power over his human property and restricting blacks' access to freedom. Violence lay at the heart of the slave system. Even a planter like Landon Carter, who prided himself on the concern for the well-being of his slaves, noted casually in his diary, quote, "They have been severely whipped day by day." Race took on more and more importance as a line of social division. Whites increasingly considered free blacks dangerous and undesirable. Free blacks lost the right to employ white servants and bear arms, were subjected to special taxes, and could be punished for striking a white person regardless of the cause. In 1723, Virginia revoked the voting privileges of property-owning free blacks. When the Lords of Trade in London asked Virginia's governor to justify discriminating among freedmen because of their skin color, he responded that, quote, "A distinction ought to be made between their offspring and the descendants of an Englishman, with whom they never were to be accounted equal." Because Virginia law required that freed slaves be sent out of the colony, free blacks remained only a tiny part of the population, less than 4% in 1760. Free and white had become virtually identical. As in early Virginia, frontier conditions allowed leeway to South Carolina's small population of African-born slaves who farmed, tended livestock, and were initially allowed to serve in the militia to fight the Spanish and Indians. And as in Virginia, the introduction of a marketable staple crop, in this case rice, led directly to economic development, the large-scale importation of slaves, and a growing divide between white and black. South Carolina was the first mainland colony to achieve a black majority. By the 1730s, by which time North Carolina had become a separate colony, 2/3 of its population was black. In the 1740s, another staple, indigo, a crop used in producing blue dye, was developed. Like rice, indigo required large-scale cultivation and was grown by slaves. Ironically, it was Africans, familiar with the crop at home, who taught English settlers how to cultivate rice, which then became the foundation of South Carolina slavery and of the wealthiest slave-owning class on the North American mainland. Since rice production requires considerable capital investment to drain swamps and create irrigation systems, it is economically advantageous for rice plantations to be as large as possible. Thus, South Carolina planters owned far more land and slaves than their counterparts in Virginia. Moreover, since mosquitoes bearing malaria, a disease to which Africans had developed partial immunity, flourished in watery rice fields, planters tended to leave plantations under the control of overseers and the slaves themselves. In the Chesapeake, field slaves worked in groups under constant supervision. Slaves were often worked under the gang system. The gang system is based on key factors including division of labor and strict supervision of slaves working together in groups. This mode of work was common, for example, in the hoeing of cotton, in which several dozen slaves could be employed together on large plantations. At times, hoe gangs were used in tandem with plow gangs for whom they set the pace for work. Under the task system that developed in 18th century South Carolina, individual slaves were assigned daily jobs, the completion of which allowed them time for leisure or to cultivate crops of their own. In 1762, one rice district had a population of only 76 white males among 1,000 slaves. Fearful of the ever-increasing black population majority, South Carolina's legislature took steps to encourage the immigration of poor Protestants, offering each newcomer a cash bounty and occasionally levying taxes on slave imports, only to see such restrictions overturned in London. By 1770, the number of South Carolina slaves had reached 75,000, well over half the colony's population. Rice cultivation also spread into Georgia in the mid-18th century. In fact, Georgia became a miniature version of South Carolina, where, by 1770, as many as 15,000 slaves labored on its coastal rice plantations. Compared to the plantation regions, slavery was far less central to the economies of New England and the middle colonies, where small farms predominated. slaves made up only a small percentage of these colonies' populations, and it was unusual even for rich families to own more than one or two slaves. Nonetheless, slavery was not entirely marginal to northern colonial lives. Slaves worked as farm hands, in artisan shops, as stevedores loading and unloading ships, and as personal servants. With slaves so small a part of the population that they seemed to pose no threat to the white majority, laws were less harsh than in the South. In New England, where in 1770 the 15,000 slaves represented less than 3% of the region's population, slave marriages were recognized in law. The severe physical punishment of slaves was prohibited, and slaves could bring suits in court, testify against whites, and own property and pass it on to their children, rights unknown in the South. Slavery had been present in New York from the earliest days of Dutch settlement. With white immigration lagging behind that of Pennsylvania, the colony's Hudson Valley landlords, small farmers, and craftsmen continued to employ considerable amounts of slave labor in the 18th century. As New York City's role in the slave trade expanded, so did slavery in the city. In 1746, its 2,440 slaves amounted to 1/5 of the city's total population. Some 30% of its laborers were slaves, a proportion second only to Charlestown among American cities. Most were domestic workers, but slaves worked in all sectors of the economy. In 1770, about 27,000 slaves lived in New York and New Jersey, 10% of their total population. Slavery also had a significant presence in Philadelphia, although it stagnated after 1750 as merchants and artisans relied increasingly on wage laborers, whose numbers were augmented by population growth and the completion of the terms of indentured servants. In an urban economy that expanded and contracted according to the ups and downs of international trade, many employers concluded that relying on wage labor, which could be hired and fired at will, made more economic sense than a long-term investment in slaves. It says slave houses. It's a little bit cut off there. The nearly 300,000 Africans brought to the mainland colonies during the 18th century were not a single people. They came from different cultures, spoke different languages, and practiced many religions. Eventually, an African American people would emerge from the diverse peoples transported to the British colonies in the Middle Passage. Slavery threw together individuals who would never otherwise have encountered one another, and who had never considered their color or residence on a single continent a source of identity or unity. Their bond was not kinship, language, or even race, but slavery itself. The process of creating a cohesive culture and community took many years, and it proceeded at different rates in different regions. But by the 19th century, slaves no longer identified themselves as Igbo, Ashanti, Yoruba, and so on, but as African Americans. In music, art, folklore, language, and religion, their cultural expressions emerged as a synthesis of African traditions, European elements, and new conditions in America. For most of the 18th century, the majority of American slaves were African by birth. Advertisements seeking information about runaways often described them by African origin. Sorry about that. Young Gambia Negro, New Bambara Negro Fellow, and spoke of their bearing on their bodies, country marks, visible signs of ethnic identity in Africa. Indeed, during the 18th century, black life in the colonies was re-Africanized, as the earlier Creoles, slaves born in the New World, came to be outnumbered by large-scale importations from Africa. Compared with the earliest generations of slaves, the newcomers worked harder, died earlier, and had less access to freedom. Charles Hansford, a white Virginia blacksmith, noted in a 1753 poem that he had frequently heard slaves speak of their desire to re-enjoy life in Africa. Quote, I oft with pleasure have observed how they their sultry country's worth strive to display, in broken language, how they praise their case, and happiness when in their native place. How would they dangers court and pains endure, if to their country they could get secure? We will continue this discussion, talking about religion in the next part.